He climbed up the rock, where no human foot had trodden for decades, and suddenly noticed a strange rectangular outline hidden by moss and rotten beams. Curiosity overcame caution, and he decided to open the mysterious door. But what he saw inside made him freeze in his tracks, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The wind coming off the ridge was crisp enough to sting his cheeks, but Marcus Hale welcomed the bite of it. It was the kind of air that felt clean, untouched by the noise and grime of the city, as if each breath swept a layer of weariness off his soul. He adjusted the strap of his pack across his shoulder and let his eyes roam over the valley below, the sprawl of pine and granite fading into shadow as afternoon began its slow crawl toward evening. This was what he lived for. Those moments when the world seemed impossibly wide and the only sound was the steady rhythm of his own breathing. For most of his life, Marcus had been chasing edges. Growing up in the south side of Chicago, he had known edges of a different sort. The razor-sharp boundaries of neighborhood lines, the invisible borders you crossed at your peril, the edges of opportunity where most kids like him found themselves staring over but never crossing. His escape had been a field trip at 12 years old, a charity-funded weekend in the Wisconsin woods. He still remembered the smell of the forest after rain, the silence under the trees broken only by the crunch of his boots on wet leaves. It was the first time he had felt safe in a space that was bigger than himself. From there, the seed had grown. By the time he finished a stint in the Army, where he had trained in mountaineering and survival, he knew he was never going to live a life behind concrete walls again. Now, at 41, he had built a modest career as an alpine guide and wilderness documentarian. His YouTube channel and blog drew a niche but loyal audience who came for the way he framed the world. Not as a playground for thrill-seekers, but as a living thing with moods and tempers to be respected more than conquered. That was why he rarely took the easy, well-trodden routes. The mountains had secrets, and Marcus wanted to find them. This time, the seed of the journey had been planted in the least likely of places, a dusty, dim-lit corner of a Denver flea market. He'd been passing through town after finishing a guiding trip when a bundle of old papers in a weather-beaten box caught his attention. Among brittle postcards and faded train tickets lay a folded topographic map, its edges yellowed and soft from handling. The date printed in the corner read 1954. A series of penciled annotations snaked across the section marked Colorado Rockies, including a faint dotted line that ran toward a place labeled Eagle Ridge. There was something about the way that line just stopped, vanishing into the shading that denoted steep, impassable terrain. No modern map in Marcus's memory showed a trail there. Back at his motel, he cross-referenced it against current topographic data. Nothing. No road, no footpath, no climb notation. It was as if the area had been scrubbed from the cartography entirely. For Marcus, that was irresistible. Either it was a forgotten goat track that had been deemed too hazardous to mark, or it was something else entirely, something abandoned, overlooked, and waiting for someone to come along and see it again. He spent 2 days preparing. Every piece of gear was checked and rechecked. His climbing harness, belay devices, carabiners, cams, ropes, his helmet-mounted camera, and a small foldable drone. He packed 2 GPS units, one for navigation, the other as a tracker should anything happen. Clothing was layered for variable weather. Base thermal layers, a fleece, and a waterproof shell. He carried food for 4 days, plus a compact stove, water filtration, and a small first aid kit that had seen enough action to carry more tape and suture than over-the-counter painkillers. By the 3rd morning, his old Toyota Land Cruiser was pointed toward the mountains, its tires crunching over gravel and dirt as the road narrowed and the forest closed in. Sunlight flickered through lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, striping the dashboard in gold and shadow. He knew from the maps that the closest he could drive would still leave him half a day's hike from the area where the dotted trail began, but that only added to the pull in his chest. Places worth finding didn't come with parking lots and gift shops. Eventually, the track degraded to little more than a pair of ruts, grass, and moss growing in the center strip. A shallow creek crossed the path, the wooden planks of a makeshift bridge bowing under the Land Cruiser's weight. Beyond it, the trees began to thin, and the mountains rose in earnest, sheer faces of reddish stone streaked with black lichen and pale veins of quartz. Marcus parked in a small clearing, the engine ticking as it cooled. For a moment, he just sat there, hands on the wheel, listening to the layered silence, the distant call of a raven, the whisper of wind high above in the needles, the deep, almost inaudible hum of the earth itself. He started on foot, following what remained of an old trail. The first hour was gentle enough, winding through the knee-high grass and stands of aspen just beginning to show the first buds of spring. Every so often he spotted relics of human presence, the rotting stump of a fence post, a rusted length of chain half buried in soil, the crumpled frame of a tin sign too weathered to read. Gradually, the ground began to tilt upward. The grass thinned to patches of dirt and stone, and the aspens gave way to scraggly pines clinging to the slope. By early afternoon, he reached a point where the trail narrowed to a ledge no wider than his boot soles, hugging the base of a cliff. The rock here was a deep, burnt red, fractured in places into loose scree that skittered away at the touch. Marcus paused to drink, the canteen cool in his hand, and let his gaze drift along the cliff face. That was when he saw it. A weathered, bullet-riddled metal sign standing crooked among the rocks. Faded letters still clung to its surface, the paint cracked but legible enough to make out two words: Eagle Ridge. He felt a jolt of recognition, the same as when he'd first unfolded the map. Here was proof, physical and undeniable, that someone had once thought this place important enough to name, to mark, and to warn about. The sign's edges were jagged with rust, and moss grew in the bullet holes, but it stood its ground against decades of weather. Marcus stepped closer, tracing a finger over the pitted surface, and for an instant he imagined the hands that had planted it, the boots that had trodden this same ledge before the trail was forgotten. The sun was dropping toward the ridgeline now, the light turning molten against the rock. He chose a flattish patch of ground sheltered by a curve of stone and pitched his tent there for the night. As the shadows deepened, he boiled water for a meal, the hiss of the stove the only sound in the still air. Somewhere, far below, the creek murmured its endless route toward the valley. He studied the map again by headlamp, noting how tomorrow's route would take him closer to the base of the cliffs where the dotted line abruptly ended. That was where the real mystery began. When he finally zipped the tent flap and lay down, sleep was slow to come. His mind kept drifting to the unknown ahead, to the way the ridge loomed in the darkness, its silhouette sharp against a sky crowded with stars. He had been in many wild places before, but this one felt different, less like a destination and more like an invitation. Something was waiting out there, somewhere beyond the edge of every map he'd ever known. Dawn seeped slowly into the mountains, washing the cliffs in pale gold and pulling Marcus from a light, restless sleep. The air inside his tent was cold enough to cloud his breath, but he didn't mind. Cold was familiar, a constant in the high country, something you worked with rather than fought against. He broke camp in silence, rolling his sleeping bag tight, stowing each item in its place. Outside, the world was still hushed, the valley below shrouded in a gauzy morning mist, the peaks above already catching the sun. He strapped his pack to his back and glanced at the old map once more, the faded dotted line a whisper of direction across the paper. It curved towards the cliffs ahead, ending abruptly as though swallowed by the stone itself. The first hour of hiking was steady but taxing, the slope growing steeper, the footing looser. Each step kicked small stones free, sending them rattling down toward unseen gullies. The air was thinner here, the scent of pine fading into the drier, sharper tang of sun-warmed rock. Marcus moved carefully, mindful of the weight on his shoulders and the precarious drop at his side. The ledge he followed was barely more than a suggestion carved into the cliff face, likely widened only by years of weather wearing away the softer stone. He was scanning the rock for the safest route when something unusual caught his eye. At first, it was just an impression, a subtle change in the way the light hit the cliff, an interruption in the chaotic pattern of cracks and ridges. He slowed, narrowing his focus. There, about 30 feet to his right and a little above his current path, the cliff bore a set of lines too straight, too deliberate to be the work of wind and water. They formed a sharp rectangle, the edges almost perfectly vertical and horizontal. From this angle, it was faint, almost invisible, but once he'd seen it, he couldn't unsee it. He stopped to catch his breath, squinting against the glare. The shape didn't match any natural fracture he'd encountered before. It was precise, geometric. Instinct told him this was not an accident of geology. Without realizing it, he found himself glancing between the contour and the map in his pocket, as if some answer might emerge in the inked lines. But the map offered only silence. Curiosity began to outweigh the steady rhythm of his climb. The safe choice was to continue along the established ledge until it curved toward the top of the ridge, but the shape above pulled at him, a quiet dare in the stone. To reach it, he would have to alter his route, cutting across to a much narrower ledge that would take him closer. It was risky. The rock there looked brittle, and there was no guarantee the ledge would hold. He anchored himself to a solid point in the cliff, double-checking the knots with the practiced motions of someone who'd done this more times than he could count. The sound of the rope feeding through his belay device was reassuring, the scrape of metal against metal grounding him in the moment. He shifted his weight slowly, edging toward the thinner ledge. Each movement was deliberate. 3 points of contact, test the next hold, move. Gravel crumbled under his boots, tumbling into the void below. The wind picked up as he moved laterally, brushing against his face, carrying with it the faint mineral smell of the high rock. The sun slid behind a wisp of cloud, softening the light and making the shadowed contour stand out even more starkly. It was definitely a rectangle, and the closer he got, the more he saw signs that it wasn't just a discoloration in the stone. The edges were beveled, the surface within slightly recessed. He imagined the precision tools it would take to cut something like this into solid rock here, far from any road or settlement. After a tense few minutes, his boots found purchase on the narrow lip of the ledge. There was barely enough space for one foot in front of the other, the wall to his left, empty space yawning to his right. He steadied himself, slowing his breathing until the pounding in his ears faded. From here, the lines in the rock were unmistakable, an outline framing what could only be a door, half hidden behind decades of neglect. It wasn't just stone. Beneath the growth of moss and the crust of lichen, he could see a dull, rusted sheen. Metal. The rectangle was a door frame set into the cliff itself, the surface concealed behind rotting wooden beams crisscrossed with corroded metal straps. The beams sagged with age, warped and split in places, as if they had been put there to seal the entrance rather than support it. The smell coming from the cracks was faint but distinct, a mix of damp earth and old, oxidized steel. Marcus took a slow step closer, leaning in to examine the craftsmanship. Whoever had built this had done so with skill, but they had also gone to considerable effort to keep it hidden. The wooden planks were not randomly placed. They had been fitted tight and bound in a way that suggested deliberate sealing. Time and weather had done their part to weaken the barrier, but it still stood, a stubborn remnant of some past intent. He reached out and ran his fingers along one of the beams. The wood was soft to the touch, the grain swollen from years of absorbing moisture. It flaked under the lightest pressure, leaving his fingertips dusty. The metal straps were pitted with rust, the once sharp edges dulled, but they remained firm in place. As his hand lingered there, he felt the faint vibration of wind passing through unseen gaps, as though the mountain itself was breathing faintly through its sealed mouth. Behind him, the ledge curved away, leading back toward the safer route up. He glanced at it only briefly. The rest of the world could wait. Here in this unlikely place was something that wasn't on any map, something that whispered of stories buried under rock and time. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, not from fear, but from the sharp thrill of discovery. He eased himself back against the wall and reached for the pack slung across his shoulder. His camera came free with a practiced motion, the lens cap popping off with a muted click. He began taking photographs from different angles, documenting every detail: the weathering on the beams, the corrosion on the straps, the seams between the metal and the stone. The soft hum of the camera's autofocus was loud in the hush of the ledge. When he was satisfied, he stowed the camera and took a moment to simply stand there, feeling the cold seep from the rock into his back. This was no accident of nature. Someone had built this into the mountain, then gone to great lengths to erase it from the world. Whatever lay behind it had been meant to stay out of sight for a very long time. The sun slipped free of the cloud again, and the glare forced him to squint. He knew he couldn't linger here indefinitely. This narrow perch was no place to set up for long. But leaving without knowing what was behind those beams was unthinkable. The mystery was a living thing now, coiled tight inside his chest. He glanced down the ledge toward where it widened again, planning his next move. This discovery had changed the nature of the climb. He wasn't just following a forgotten trail anymore. He had stumbled upon a question big enough to rewrite the day, maybe the whole expedition. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a landmark, it was a threshold, and it was waiting for him to cross. By the time he began inching his way back to a slightly broader section of rock, his mind was already working through the possibilities. What tools he'd need to breach the barrier, how much time he could spare, how to do it without compromising safety. The mountains always demanded respect, but so did whatever human hands had done here. He reached the wider ledge and paused, looking back once more at the faint lines of the door, now half in shadow again. The wind rose briefly, sighing across the cliff face, and in that sound he thought he heard something else. An echo, perhaps, or just his imagination feeding on the strangeness of the place. Either way, he knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow he would return to this spot prepared to go further. Whatever lay hidden in the cliff had been waiting decades. It could wait one more night, but not longer. Morning returned with a pale, silvery light that spilled over the ridge and set the frost on Marcus's tent aglow. The cold had deepened overnight, sinking into the stones and the fabric of his shelter, and he felt it in his bones as he stretched inside his sleeping bag. Outside, the mountains stood in perfect stillness, their peaks edged with the first glow of the sun. He took his time breaking camp, not because he doubted what he would do next, but because he understood the gravity of it. Yesterday he had stumbled upon something that had no place being there, something sealed and hidden in the cliff. Today he meant to open it. He packed deliberately, double-checking every strap and buckle, sliding his tools into easy reach. Alongside his climbing gear and camera, he placed a short but sturdy crowbar, a hammer, and a compact folding saw meant for clearing wood. He wasn't sure how much resistance the barrier would put up after decades of neglect, but he intended to be ready for whatever he found. The rope went over his shoulder, the pack settled firmly against his back, and he set off with a steady pace toward the section of cliff that had haunted his thoughts all night. The climb back to the ledge felt different now, not just a physical task, but a narrowing of focus, each foothold and handhold pulling him closer to that door-shaped outline. The air was still, almost unnaturally so, the sounds of the valley muted as though the mountain were holding its breath. By the time he reached the narrow path that led to the hidden ledge, the world around him had receded into the background. His pulse was steady but strong, his movements precise. The ledge greeted him like an old adversary, narrow, brittle, just enough space for his boots to move one at a time. He shifted sideways, keeping his back to the wall, his eyes fixed on the barrier ahead. It loomed larger with every step, the beams warped and darkened with age, the metal straps dulled by corrosion. Up close, the wood looked worse than he remembered, fibrous and spongy in places, splintered in others, the grain swollen from decades of moisture. Moss clung to the seams where the beams met the frame, and pale strands of lichen trailed like cobwebs from the rusted straps. Marcus anchored himself securely, setting the rope to give him stability on the narrow perch, then pulled the crowbar from his pack. The first wedge into the wood was met with a muffled crack, the sound deep and oddly hollow against the stone. He worked methodically, prying and twisting, feeling the old nails give way one by one. Each movement released a faint smell, earthy and metallic, with the sharp tang of rot that had been trapped too long in darkness. The mountain seemed to listen as he worked, the scrape of metal on wood echoing back to him in low, distorted murmurs. Beams broke reluctantly, snapping with a dry finality that made him pause between strikes. It was hard to shake the sense that the barrier wasn't just meant to keep things out, but to keep something in. The thought lingered in the back of his mind as he moved to the next strap, setting the crowbar against the rusted metal. The strap gave with less resistance than he expected, peeling away from the wood with a screech that faded into the silence like a reluctant confession. One by one, the obstacles fell away. The wood grew softer toward the center, crumbling under the pressure of his tools until at last the final beam sagged and split, falling to the ledge in pieces. Dust and tiny fragments of debris swirled in the thin air. He paused, his crowbar still in hand, staring at the dark shape that opened before him. It wasn't just darkness. It was the kind of absence that felt tangible, a void that swallowed the light at its threshold. The frame was lined with thick metal, the inner edges beveled and bolted to the stone as though to reinforce it against some unimaginable force. A breath of air escaped from within, cold and damp, carrying with it the scent of wet stone, rust, and something older, harder to name. It wrapped around him like a ghost, seeping under his jacket and settling in his chest. Marcus switched the crowbar for his headlamp, fastening it in place. A beam of white light cut through the dark, revealing a narrow concrete corridor sloping gently downward. The walls were rough and damp, mottled with patches of moss and streaks where water had trickled for years. The floor bore a faint, gritty sheen, scattered with small pebbles and debris that glistened under the lamp. Each breath he took inside seemed heavier, as if the air here had been still for decades and resented being disturbed. He stepped inside, his boots crunching softly on the gritty floor. The sound was swallowed almost instantly, replaced by the subtle drip of water somewhere deeper in the tunnel. The temperature dropped noticeably within a few paces, and he could feel the damp settling on his skin. It was like entering the hollow of a giant's bones, each wall curving inward just enough to feel close without quite touching. A few meters in, the beam of his headlamp caught the glint of metal along the floor, two narrow rails spaced just far enough apart for a small cart. They were rusted and warped, vanishing into the shadows ahead. Beside them sat the skeletal remains of a cart itself, its metal frame pitted and its wheels fused in place by rust. A rotted wooden handle still clung stubbornly to one side, dark with age and moisture. In the corner, leaning against the wall, was a shovel with a cracked wooden handle. The blade was caked with a thin crust of mineral deposits, as if it had been left there mid-task. A few feet beyond, partially collapsed into the gravel, lay a pair of leather boots, their laces rotted away, the leather sagging and furred with mold. Marcus crouched to inspect them. The stitching was coarse, the style old, too old to be anything recent. He imagined them once laced tight on the feet of a man working here, the rhythm of shovel against rock echoing through the passage, never suspecting his tools and boots would outlive him by decades. Rising again, Marcus shifted the light toward the wall, where a faded white paint spelled out words just barely legible. Property of us government. Keep out. The paint had run in places, the letters softened and broken by time, but the warning was unmistakable. He reached out, brushing the surface lightly, and felt the grain of the concrete beneath the paint, rough under his fingertips. The tunnel pressed on ahead, the rails leading deeper, the air growing colder. A drop of water fell from the ceiling and struck the back of his neck, startling in its chill. He adjusted his pack and continued forward, his footsteps echoing an uneven rhythm with the slow, steady dripping. Somewhere, far ahead, the tunnel curved, the light from his headlamp pooling in the darkness like a fragile island. He didn't know yet what this place had been, but the deliberate construction, the ceiling, and the warning painted in plain sight told him it was never meant for casual eyes. The mountain had kept its secret well, and now he was walking straight into it. The thought sent a low tremor through him, not fear exactly, but the sharp awareness of stepping into a story whose ending was still unwritten. Behind him, the open doorway waited like a mouth frozen mid-breath, the pale light of the ledge barely touching the threshold. Ahead, the mountain's heart beckoned, cold and silent, and Marcus kept walking. The tunnel seemed to draw him onward with a quiet insistence, each step carrying him farther from the pale rectangle of daylight that framed the entrance. The deeper Marcus moved, the more the air changed. It wasn't only colder here. It was heavy in a way that pressed against his chest, thick with the smell of stone long closed to the outside. His headlamp carved a narrow path through the gloom, revealing the walls ahead one step at a time. The rough concrete was scarred by water stains, streaked with mineral deposits that glowed faintly under the beam. The rails along the floor continued in a stubborn straight line, though in places they were warped, buckling upward or dipping under gravel that had spilled from the walls. Somewhere in the dark, water dripped in a slow, steady rhythm, as if marking the time that had passed since this place was last alive. He moved cautiously, setting a small beacon on the ground every few minutes, its soft green light blinking like an artificial firefly. Each one marked the way back in case the twists of the tunnel became disorienting, or worse, if the air grew so heavy that finding the exit in haste became necessary. It was a habit born from years of exploring places where retreat could be as dangerous as the advance. After what felt like 20 minutes of steady descent, Marcus noticed a break in the monotony of the walls. A pile of debris slumped against one side of the tunnel, shards of concrete, splinters of wood, fragments of rusted metal. At first, it looked like part of the wall had simply collapsed, but when he shone his light upward, he saw the faint outline of a doorway hidden behind the rubble. The frame was steel, and the space beyond it seemed to widen. He set down his pack and began clearing the obstruction, piece by piece, mindful of each movement. The scrape of stone against stone echoed strangely, as though the sound bent around corners he couldn't see. When enough of the debris had been moved aside, Marcus stepped through. His headlamp beam expanded across a larger chamber, and for a moment, the sight stopped him in place. Rows of metal bed frames stretched away from him, their paint blistered, their mattresses sagging in dark, moldy heaps. Thin blankets still clung to some of them, stiff and brittle as paper. The air here was colder still, and each exhale emerged in a faint cloud. He walked slowly between the rows, the beam of his lamp tracing over the remains of a life once lived here. Tin cans lay scattered on the floor, their labels faded to pale ghosts of color. A table sagged under the weight of dust and a stack of notebooks, their pages swollen with moisture. Against one wall, a cluster of metal lockers stood ajar, empty except for the occasional rusted hinge or a forgotten scrap of cloth. There was a feeling to this place that Marcus recognized from other abandoned sites, but amplified, an absence so complete it felt like a presence in itself. Yet it wasn't only abandonment that lingered here. There was a sharp, unsettled energy in the arrangement of things, as though whoever had been here last had left in haste. A folding chair lay overturned in the corner, its legs bent awkwardly. A coffee mug, cracked and rimmed with dust, rested on its side on the floor. Near the far wall, something caught his attention, a series of maps tacked to a corkboard, their corners curling. They were geological surveys, he realized, their fine lines and color-coded sections mapping the interior of the mountain in painstaking detail. But large portions had been torn away, leaving jagged gaps where the most detailed markings should have been. The remaining sections bore smudges of soot, and a metal bin nearby contained what looked like the charred edges of paper. Marcus moved on, and that was when he found it. Half hidden under a fallen shelf, a book bound in worn brown leather. The cover was cracked with age, but the name stamped into it was still legible: Dr. Harold Keene. He brushed the dust away with the side of his glove and opened it carefully. The first few pages were still intact, though the ink had bled in places from damp. The early entries read like the precise notes of a scientist: dates, coordinates, observations about rock strata and water movement. Keene and his team, it seemed, had been here to study underground water systems, measuring flow rates, tracing mineral content, cataloging seismic readings. Marcus flipped forward. The handwriting began to change, the lines less even, the script rushed. There were mentions of gas pockets found deeper in the tunnels, some under high pressure. He could almost see the image in his mind. A drill biting into rock, the sudden hiss of a release, the acrid bite of something in the air. Then came the stranger entries. The mountain groaned again last night, one page read, not like a rockfall or settling, more like it was alive. Another note mentioned lights flickering without power running, and faint voices that couldn't be traced to any of the team. The tone was no longer clinical. It was edged with unease. On one of the last legible pages, Keene had scrawled, "Air wrong, lights won't stay on. Can't sleep, feels like it's breathing." Marcus closed the journal slowly, a faint chill crawling along his spine. This was no ordinary research station, no simple mining outpost. The evidence of panic was everywhere, from the scattered belongings to the torn maps to the burned papers. He could imagine the scene. A team working steadily until the first hints of something they couldn't explain crept in, unsettling them, pushing them toward decisions made in haste. Something had driven them out, and whatever it was, they had either tried to hide it or destroy the records of it before leaving. He stood in the center of the room, the silence around him deep enough to hear the faint ringing in his own ears. Somewhere beyond this space, the tunnel continued, and he could feel its pull. But now there was a weight to that pull. The knowledge that he wasn't only following the lines of a forgotten passage, he was tracing the final steps of people who had fled, perhaps running from something more than just the dark. When he finally turned to leave the room, his headlamp caught on a single locker door hanging open wider than the rest. Inside, on a top shelf, a glass jar sat untouched, its lid sealed. The contents were murky, and he couldn't quite tell if they were sediment or something organic. He didn't touch it. Some things, he felt, were better left exactly as they had been found. Back in the main tunnel, Marcus adjusted the strap of his pack and glanced at the green glow of the last beacon behind him. The rails ahead vanished into the darkness, curving slightly to the left. He knew he would follow them. Whatever had happened here, whatever had driven Dr. Keene and his team to leave in such disorder, the answers weren't in the bunk room. They were deeper in the mountain, waiting in the places no one had walked for decades. He took a breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and stepped forward. The echoes of his boots on the concrete floor seemed louder now, bouncing off the walls in a slow, steady rhythm. The beacons behind him faded into small, blinking points of light until they disappeared entirely. Ahead, the tunnel narrowed again, drawing him onward, and Marcus felt the first faint thread of dread wind its way into his determination. Whatever lay beyond, he would see it. But he was beginning to understand why no one had come back. The tunnel seemed to close in around him the deeper he went, the walls pressing tighter as though the mountain itself was aware of his presence. The cold was heavier now, not just a matter of temperature, but a weight that settled into his limbs, slowing his movements. Marcus kept his pace steady, his headlamp cutting a narrow cone of light into the darkness ahead, the beam catching glints from mineral veins embedded in the concrete walls. The rails along the floor were more twisted here, warped into uneven curves, as though something had shifted in the earth long after they were laid. Each step crunched on scattered gravel and the brittle remains of objects long since collapsed into dust. The narrow curve of the tunnel turned once, then again, and he began to feel the faintest draft against his face, a whisper of air moving from somewhere far ahead. It wasn't the clean bite of wind he'd felt outside. This was different, staler, thicker, touched with a metallic edge. He slowed, letting his light probe the corridor before him. The curve straightened into a long, unbroken stretch, and at its far end something loomed in the shadows, a shape that broke the monotony of the walls. Marcus's first impression was of sheer size. The shape resolved as he drew closer, the beam of his headlamp picking out planes of steel mottled with rust and scratches. It was a door, but not the kind that swung on hinges. This was a vault door, massive and overbuilt, the kind designed to withstand explosions, floods, or worse. The frame was embedded deep into the concrete, the seals around it thick and bolted in place. The color must once have been a dull gray, but years of damp air had mottled it with blooms of corrosion, orange-brown against the cold metal. He stopped several paces away, taking in the details. The locking mechanisms were intact, heavy wheel cranks and sliding bolts that had been forced shut long ago. Some of the bolts were bent, as if they'd been slammed into place in a hurry or under stress. Scratches scored the surface around the handles, deep gouges that suggested tools or desperate hands had once worked here. And then he saw the paint. It wasn't neat lettering. It looked as though someone had taken a brush or even a hand and smeared red paint in hurried strokes across the door. The words were crude but legible. "Do not open. We couldn't contain it." The paint had run in rivulets down the surface, dried into hardened trails that looked disturbingly like old blood in the beam of his headlamp. Marcus stood very still, his breath clouding faintly in the cold air. The message wasn't meant as a warning to the casual passerby. No one stumbled in here by accident. This was for whoever had been inside, a desperate plea to themselves or to the next team that might come after. The weight of those words pressed on him more heavily than the cold. He could hear, in some imagined way, the panic in the strokes of paint, the urgency behind the choice of words. Beside the vault, the wall had partially collapsed, leaving a jagged opening into blackness. He stepped closer, angling his light into the gap. The beam slid over the rough, broken edges of concrete and rebar, then dropped into what appeared to be a vertical shaft. The darkness there was absolute, a depth that swallowed the light entirely. A faint breath of air rose from below, sharper and colder than the rest of the tunnel, carrying a smell that was both metallic and chemical. It was the kind of scent that made the back of his throat tighten, a flavor of something unnatural lingering in the air. Marcus crouched at the edge, careful to keep his weight balanced away from the drop, and fished a small handheld meter from his pack. It was a compact radiation detector, one he often carried into old industrial sites as a precaution. He powered it on, expecting it to hum softly at background levels. Instead, the numbers began to climb, slowly at first, then holding at a point higher than normal. Not in the range to cause immediate harm, but enough to confirm that whatever lay beyond this point wasn't untouched wilderness. He stood, sliding the meter back into his pack, and turned his attention again to the vault door. Every instinct in him as a climber, a hiker, an explorer told him that this was a line. Beyond this, there was no knowing what he might disturb. He imagined what might be on the other side. Machinery left to rot in darkness, unstable chemicals, the bones of those who had never made it out. Or perhaps nothing at all. Just an empty space sealed more out of paranoia than necessity. But the note in the journal he had found earlier came back to him. The gas pockets, the tremors, the sensation of the mountain breathing. And those final words. The air wrong, the voices, the lights. His gloved hand hovered near the cold steel of the wheel crank, and for a moment he wondered what it would feel like to turn it, to hear the heavy bolts slide free and the hinges groan. The thought was as intoxicating as it was dangerous. This was the threshold, the ultimate unknown in this place, and he could cross it in a matter of minutes. But the painted words held him back, their meaning clear even through the haze of time. He stepped back, his boots scraping softly on the grit of the floor. The cold seemed to deepen the farther he moved from the door, as though it disapproved of his retreat. But he reminded himself of the truth that had kept him alive in mountains and ruins alike. Not every mystery was meant to be solved in the moment you discovered it. Some were better studied from a distance, respected rather than conquered. As he turned away, the beam of his headlamp swept over the edges of the door one last time, catching on the lines of rust, the uneven strokes of red paint, the bent bolts. It looked less like a secure barrier now, and more like a tombstone, marking a place where something had been buried alive. The image stayed with him as he began the slow walk back through the tunnel, the sound of his footsteps echoing in a rhythm that seemed just slightly out of sync with his own. The beacons he had left glimmered faintly in the distance, small islands of green light in the darkness. He followed them, each blink pulling him farther from the door and whatever lay sealed behind it. The draft faded as he moved away, the air becoming still again, but the metallic tang clung stubbornly to the back of his tongue. By the time he reached the larger chamber with the bunks, he felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, though the thought of the door still pressed at the edges of his mind. He knew he would not forget it, nor the sensation of standing before it with his hand poised to break a decades-old seal. It was a decision that would follow him, a fork in the path of his own story. He had chosen caution for now, but the mountain was patient, and so was he. Somewhere behind him, deep in the blackness, the vault waited, its warning written in fading red. And in the silence that wrapped around him as he made his way toward the faint promise of daylight, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they had failed to contain was still there, listening. When Marcus finally turned his back on the vault and began the long walk out, the darkness seemed to stretch and bend around him, reluctant to let him go. The green blink of his last beacon was a fragile point of reassurance ahead, and he fixed his eyes on it, forcing his steps into a steady rhythm. The air felt heavier now, as if the tunnel itself disapproved of his retreat, the cold clinging to his skin even beneath his layered clothing. Every so often, he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see something following at the edge of his headlamp's reach, though the corridor behind him remained empty and still. As he passed back through the bunk room, the scattered remnants of its former occupants took on a different weight in his mind. It no longer felt like a simple place of habitation long abandoned. It felt like the shell of a moment frozen in panic. He could picture the people who had slept here, who had laughed or argued or eaten in these same shadows, and then the night when they'd fled, perhaps glancing back over their shoulders in fear, leaving mugs on tables and papers scattered across the floor. The smell of damp and decay was sharper now, mingled with the faint sting of the metallic air from deeper inside. He moved on, retrieving each beacon in turn, the green lights winking out one by one until the tunnel was lit only by his own lamp. By the time he caught sight of the sliver of daylight at the end of the corridor, his shoulders ached from tension and the weight of his pack, but there was a steady calm building in him too. Outside meant air that had not been trapped for decades, sky that was open and unbounded. Stepping onto the narrow ledge again, Marcus was met by the mountain's wind, sharp and almost clean compared to the stagnant chill within. He paused there for a moment, letting the breeze wash over him, listening to the muted roar of the valley far below. The ledge felt even narrower than before, the empty space at his right shoulder a dizzying drop into shadow. With careful, measured movements, he made his way back along the rock face to where the climbing route widened enough to anchor himself for the descent. The climb down was slower than the way up. His muscles were already tired, and the brittle stone seemed more treacherous with the weight of what he'd just seen still pressing in his thoughts. Twice he paused on small outcroppings to rest his grip and steady his breathing, the rope humming softly under his gloves as he adjusted his belay. By the time his boots found solid ground again, the sun was beginning its descent toward the far ridge, turning the rock walls around him into slabs of molten gold. He hiked back to his camp in silence, his senses tuned to the forest around him. The crunch of his boots on gravel, the faint chattering of birds, the creak of branches swaying in the wind. The mountain seemed unchanged, indifferent to what was carved into its heart. But Marcus knew better now. He'd seen the vault, read the painted words, felt the breath of the shaft beside it. There was something in that place the mountain was keeping, and it had been kept for a reason. At camp, he set down his pack with deliberate care, every muscle in his back sighing with relief. He lit his small stove, watching the blue flame flicker in the fading light as he boiled water for a meal. The smell of steam rising from the pot felt grounding, a simple, human act against the enormity of what he had just experienced. He ate without real hunger, his mind still deep in the tunnels, replaying the way the light had glanced off the rusted bolts, the bent steel, the streaks of red paint. When the dark had fully settled over the mountains, Marcus pulled out his notebook and began to write. Not just impressions, but details. The layout of the tunnels, the condition of the rails, the exact wording on the vault door, the readings from his radiation meter. He sketched rough diagrams of the bunk room and the collapsed wall beside the vault. Each line and note was another layer of memory he didn't want to risk losing to the blur of time. Once his notes were complete, he powered on his laptop. It took time for it to find a signal through the patchy mountain reception, but eventually the connection held. He composed an email to the Bureau of Land Management, describing what he'd found. He omitted his name, location, and identifying details, but gave enough information for anyone with authority, and perhaps clearance, to locate the site. He mentioned the radiation levels, the sealed vault, the signs of structural instability. In a separate message to a university geology department, he included some of his photographs, carefully chosen ones that revealed the condition of the tunnels and the old government markings, but not the exact position of the entrance. Before sending, he hesitated. The images on the screen were stark reminders of how deep he'd gone, how close he had stood to something that had been locked away for decades. There was no undoing the choice once he pressed the key. But the thought of leaving it entirely unreported didn't sit right with him either. If the site was unstable, if whatever was down there could escape or collapse, someone needed to know. With a deep breath, he hit send. Hours later, as he sat outside his tent under a sky littered with stars, the reply came. It was brief, without a signature or even a proper header. We appreciate your concern. For your safety, please do not return to that site. That was all. No request for more information, no acknowledgement of his photographs or descriptions, no assurance that they would investigate. Marcus read the words twice, then closed the laptop. The wind had picked up, brushing the tops of the trees in a restless rhythm. The temperature was dropping, and the firelight from his small camp stove cast shifting shadows across the inside of the tent. He lay back in his sleeping bag, listening to the wind, and thought of the vault again. It was still there, silent and sealed, the paint on its face slowly fading in the cold. By morning, he had made up his mind to leave the mountain. He broke camp quickly, moving with the efficiency of someone who has walked away from places that never quite let go. The trail down felt longer than the way up, but with each step the air grew warmer, the scent of pine stronger. By the time he reached the gravel track where his vehicle waited, the mountains behind him were cloaked in shadow, the ridges rising like walls against the western sky. When the engine started, its sound seemed jarringly loud after days of silence. He drove slowly, the road twisting through the trees, the peaks shrinking in the rearview mirror. He didn't look back often. He knew the vault was still there, the shaft still breathing its cold air into the dark, and whatever it was, it remained sealed away. But the words on the door had carved themselves into his memory, a quiet refrain that would surface again and again, no matter how far he traveled. We couldn't contain it. The highway unspooled beneath the tires in a blur of gray and yellow, mile after mile, carrying Marcus farther from the mountains, yet doing nothing to loosen the grip they had on his thoughts. The vault door lingered in his mind like the afterimage of staring at the sun burned into the backs of his eyelids. He could see the paint, thick and clumsy, red as rust and warning all at once. He could hear the hollow quiet that had wrapped around him in that final stretch of tunnel, a quiet that seemed to lean in and listen. The email response he had received before leaving, those 10 curt words, only sharpened the sense that he had stepped into a place where his presence had been noted, where his absence would be expected. When he reached his home 2 days later, the rhythm of normal life felt alien. The familiar creak of the porch steps, the scent of pine from the small grove behind the house, the faint hum of the refrigerator, all of it seemed somehow staged, as though the world was politely pretending nothing had happened while the memory of the mountain stood just behind the curtain. He unpacked slowly, laying his gear out in neat rows as if to take inventory of himself as much as his equipment. The crowbar still bore flecks of wood from the beams he had pried away. The headlamp's batteries were nearly drained, the notebook fattened with pages of hastily written notes. For the first day, he did nothing with the photographs or the video footage. They sat in the memory cards on his desk, their weight intangible but undeniable. When he finally powered on his editing computer, the glow of the screen illuminated the darkened room in brief pulses as file after file loaded. He scrolled through thumbnails, frames of rusted rails, moss-covered walls, the bunk room, the journal of Dr. Keene, the twisted bolts of the vault door. Each clip carried with it the air of the tunnels, the way sound moved differently there, muffled and yet poised to echo. He began watching them in order, the journey unfolding again in light and shadow. He listened to his own voice on the occasional spoken note, steady, deliberate, but edged with something he hadn't heard in himself before. In the footage from the bunk room, the camera lingered on details longer than he remembered, as if even then he'd been reluctant to move on. The vault door appeared in full toward the end, and for a long moment he just watched the frozen image, the paint, the bent metal, the collapse into the shaft beside it. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. Posting the full footage as it was would be the simplest path. His audience, small but loyal, trusted him to share the reality of the places he explored. This would be the most compelling discovery of his career. the kind of story that could ripple far beyond the world of climbing and exploration. But the thought of releasing the exact location, the unedited details, felt like stepping into the tunnel again, reaching for the crank of the vault door. He imagined people flocking to the site, urban explorers, thrill seekers, vandals. He imagined someone forcing that door, ignoring the read words, bringing into the open something that had been buried for decades for reasons unknown. He opened his editing software and began to work. The cuts were careful, surgical. He removed shots that revealed the cliff's orientation to the surrounding peaks, blurred any image that contained identifiable geographic markers. The section where his GPS screen appeared in frame was trimmed entirely. He kept the journey into the tunnel, the bunk room, the journal, and even the vault itself. But he shortened the approach, layered it with narration that spoke in generalities about the location. His voiceover described the door as being in a remote section of the Rockies, accessible only after days of travel, but nothing more precise. The footage of the shaft beside the vault he reduced to a few seconds, enough to convey its presence but not its depth or the sense of the air that rose from it. He included his radiation reading but left out the exact numbers, referring only to an unexpected anomaly. He let the words on the door appear clearly, though, "Do not open." We couldn't contain it, because to hide them would be to hide the truth entirely. Hours slipped by unnoticed as he worked, the sun outside setting and the room deepening into shadow. When the edit was complete, he watched it through from start to finish. It told the story, but not all of it. It invited the imagination to wander without providing the means to act on that curiosity. It was a line drawn in the dirt between revealing and protecting. He exported the final cut, uploaded it to his channel, and scheduled it to go live in the morning. That night, Marcus sat on the back porch with a mug of coffee gone cold, the stars spread overhead in a wash of pale fire. The quiet here was different from the mountain's quiet. It was open, without the weight of stone above. He thought about Dr. Keene and his team, about the panic in the bunk room, the journal's final entries. He thought about the paint on the vault door and the person who had stood there before him, deciding what to write, what to leave behind. He understood that choice more now than ever. The video went live just after dawn. Within hours, comments began to stack, viewers awed by the scale of the find, unsettled by the vault's warning, eager to speculate about what might lie beyond it. Theories ranged from abandoned Cold War experiments to lost mineral deposits to something far stranger. Marcus read them all but replied to none. The conversation was theirs now. The place, however, remained his. In the days that followed, the numbers climbed. News outlets reached out, some with polite inquiries, others with more aggressive demands for details. He declined them all. The footage was public. The mountain was not. 2 weeks later, curiosity led him to check the official topographic maps of the region. The dotted trail from his old flea market map had never been there, of course, but now even the surrounding area was marked as restricted land. On satellite images, the cliff's face, where the ledge lay, was blurred, as though the mountain had been smudged out of the world's memory. Marcus closed his laptop and sat for a long time in the stillness of his living room, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He had done what he felt was right. Not all of the truth, but enough to remember. The rest would stay sealed in the mountain, behind steel and paint and the air of a shaft that seemed to breathe in the dark. He knew he would carry it with him as he carried other mountains, other places where he had turned back rather than push forward. Some mysteries were not puzzles to be solved, but boundaries to be recognized. This one, he thought, would outlast him. Somewhere high in the Rockies, the vault would wait in silence, its bolts rusting, its warning fading, the cold draft from the shaft whispering into the dark. And Marcus would remember it exactly as he had left it. Closed. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out our other videos for more gripping adventures, and share this one with friends who love a good mystery.